September 1940, and the war has come to Britain in ways no one expected. German soldiers, captured during what historians would later call the failed invasion attempt, arrive at temporary holding facilities near Kempton Park Racecourse in southeastern England. These men are terrified. They've heard the stories, whispered among Wehrmacht units for months, stories about what the British do to prisoners. Berlin's propaganda machine has been relentless, painting pictures of torture chambers and summary executions, of starvation tactics designed to break a man before they finally kill him. Every captured German soldier believes he's marching toward his death. But what happens next will change everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The guards who meet them at the gates are exhausted men, soldiers who somehow survived the nightmare of Dunkirk's evacuation beaches just months earlier. These are men who watched their friends die on French soil, who spent days under relentless German fire, who made it home when thousands didn't. Now they're assigned to watch over the very men who killed their comrades. They arrive with weapons, with authority, with every possible reason to want revenge. Instead, they follow the law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 isn't just a document to the British. It's a code they actually honor, even while German bombs fall on London every single night. The prisoners receive proper food rations despite the fact that British civilians are rationing everything. They get medical care when they're sick or injured. They have shelter, the right to write home through Red Cross channels, protection from abuse. Every single provision that international law requires, Britain provides. British civilians notice immediately, and not everyone is happy about it. German prisoners are eating meat twice a week, while British families are rationing everything down to the last teaspoon of sugar. The guards don't hide this fact. They openly acknowledge that prisoners receive the same provisions as British soldiers in training camps, adjusted only for the caloric needs of men who aren't actively fighting. This creates real resentment in communities where children receive limited milk, where adults stand in lines for hours just to buy basic goods, where every family carries a ration book that determines what they can eat. But the Geneva Convention mandates equal treatment, and Britain complies, even as the Luftwaffe destroys homes overhead. By March 1941, permanent camps have established themselves across Britain. We're talking about 1,500 facilities, ranging from small hostels housing 50 men to massive camps holding 5,000. Eventually, more than 400,000 German prisoners will be confined across England, Scotland, and Wales, making this the largest prisoner population in Western Europe outside Germany itself. Each camp is organized according to War Office specifications with heated dormitory huts, mess facilities with proper kitchens, running water in the ablution blocks, recreation areas for sports, administrative buildings, and medical facilities staffed by captured German doctors working under British supervision. The prisoners organize themselves in ways that surprise everyone. They create orchestras from men who served in military bands. At Camp 21 in Comrie, Scotland, a 42-piece symphony orchestra develops under the direction of Heinrich Müller, a former violinist with the Berlin Philharmonic. Chamber ensembles form, jazz bands appear, folk music groups gather to play songs from home. By December 1943, Red Cross inspectors report 38 full orchestras across British camps, performing everything from German classical composers to British popular music, including arrangements of songs they hear on BBC radio broadcasts that they're actually permitted to listen to. Sports consume daily life in these camps. Football leagues spring up between different camp sections. British guards teach the Germans cricket, that incomprehensible game that baffles even the most athletic prisoners. Boxing tournaments are held with proper rings and referees. Athletics competitions take place on measured tracks. British authorities even organized inter-camp tournaments, actually transporting prisoners to compete against other facilities, providing equipment and referees. The goal is to help prisoners maintain physical fitness, mental health, and competitive spirit during years of confinement thousands of miles from home. Education continues behind barbed wire. University graduates teach mathematics, engineering, languages, and philosophy. Tradesmen instruct others in carpentry, metalwork, agriculture, and mechanics. Libraries at major camps stock 18,000 books, including technical manuals, literature, history texts, and language courses. Men study subjects they never had the opportunity to learn before military service conscripted them. Some even complete the equivalent of university courses through correspondence programs coordinated with British educational institutions. Art flourishes in these unlikely places. Prisoners paint the English countryside, sketch scenes of camp life, create wood carvings and metal sculptures. Exhibition spaces display their work, initially just for fellow prisoners, but eventually guards receive permission to purchase pieces, with proceeds credited to prisoner accounts managed by camp administration. The green hills of Yorkshire, the rocky coasts of Scotland, the farmland of Kent, all captured in watercolors that families back in Germany will never see. Then comes June 1943, and the British government makes a decision that will change everything. They approve German prisoners for agricultural work. Labor shortages are devastating British farms because young men are fighting overseas in North Africa and Italy, and later in France. Harvest seasons require intensive manual labor, and farmers are desperate for workers. Prisoners provide the solution. Those willing to work receive wages, 1 shilling per day initially, later increased to standard agricultural wages minus deductions for housing and food, all paid into accounts they can access for camp purchases or save for eventual repatriation. War agricultural committees establish farm hostels throughout rural Britain, in Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, and Yorkshire. Prisoners live in these smaller camps, working daily in the fields under guard supervision, or sometimes, when trust develops, working completely alone. The relationships that emerge surprise absolutely everyone. British farmers start inviting prisoners to family meals. They share afternoon tea, discuss farming methods, compare German and British agricultural practices, and develop genuine friendships despite the fact that the war is still raging across the channel. Guards begin leaving tools unattended, tools that could easily serve as weapons, and prisoners return them without incident every single time. Some farmers even house prisoners overnight during harvest emergencies with no guards present at all. German soldiers who just months earlier were fighting British forces are now living alongside British families, working their land, proving themselves reliable and hardworking, becoming absolutely essential to farming operations that feed Britain and support the war effort. By 1945, over 60,000 prisoners are working across Britain. 22,000 are in agricultural operations alone, with thousands more in forestry operations supplying timber for construction and mining, textile factories producing military supplies, and construction projects building infrastructure. The economic value becomes substantial. The government receives £28 million in 1944 from prisoner labor, with estimates suggesting that £120 million were saved that year by employing prisoners in essential industries, while British workers serve in the military or war production factories. The prisoners save their earnings and plan futures. Some begin dreaming of staying in Britain after the war ends. Complex dynamics emerge inside the camps, though, and not everything is peaceful. Hardcore Nazis maintain power in some facilities, organizing internal administration and enforcing loyalty to Hitler through intimidation. Prisoners who question Nazi ideology or express democratic sympathies face beatings, isolation, and kangaroo courts. Mail is censored by fellow prisoners to prevent news of German defeats from circulating. 3 prisoners are actually murdered by Nazi tribunals that try and execute men they consider traitors to the Reich. British authorities eventually identify the Nazi ringleaders, transfer them to isolated camps on Scottish islands, creating separate facilities for officers who refuse to work. By late 1944, denazification programs begin changing camp culture. Re-education efforts introduce democratic principles, show documentary evidence of Nazi atrocities, and encourage critical thinking about regime propaganda. As Germany's defeat becomes undeniable, Nazi influence starts to fade. Prisoners realize that cooperation will help their eventual return home. May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders, and the war in Europe finally ends. British prisoner of war camps are holding approximately 420,000 German combatants. Everyone expects rapid repatriation. The prisoners want to go home, to see families they haven't contacted except through censored letters, to rebuild their lives in a Germany finally free from Hitler's dictatorship. But reality confronts them immediately through letters from home that describe complete devastation. Hamburg destroyed by firestorm bombing. Berlin reduced to rubble by Soviet artillery and Allied air raids. Dresden burned. Cologne's cathedral standing alone among ruins. Frankfurt flattened. Munich heavily damaged. Infrastructure collapsed. Industry demolished. Millions homeless. Food scarcer than anyone can imagine. The economy completely non-existent. Soviet occupation in the East brings reports of systematic brutality, forced deportations, and summary executions. The Western zones under British, American, and French control offer better conditions, but still face massive shortages, destroyed housing, and an uncertain political future. The prisoners who worked on British farms and in factories face an additional complication that no one anticipated. They've grown comfortable in Britain. They've learned the language fluently, made genuine friends with guards and farmers and townspeople, experienced treatment far superior to anything they ever expected as prisoners of war. Many have no family remaining in Germany at all. Their homes have been destroyed by bombing. Parents are dead. Siblings were killed in combat or died in air raids. Some of these men served in the Wehrmacht only because they were conscripted, not because they supported Nazism in any way. These men see absolutely no future in returning to ruins when they've built real relationships and developed valuable skills in Britain that could provide good lives if they're just permitted to stay. 12,000 German prisoners formally request permission to remain in Britain. That's nearly 1 in 30 of all prisoners held. They petition camp commandants, write to War Office officials, express their willingness to work, to contribute, to become productive citizens of the nation that treated them humanely during 6 years of war. British authorities find themselves deeply conflicted. The country desperately needs workers for post-war reconstruction, which requires a massive labor force. Agricultural communities strongly support keeping the prisoners who proved reliable and absolutely essential to their operations. Newspaper editorials debate the question endlessly. Letters flood editors arguing both sides with passion. Some Britons support accepting former enemies who demonstrated good character and strong work ethic over years of observation. Others vehemently oppose allowing Germans to stay when British veterans are returning from overseas expecting jobs and housing. Families of men killed by Germans express outrage at the very proposal. Trade unions worry about wage competition from foreign workers willing to accept lower pay. The British government actually wants to keep them. Officials recognize the immense value these men represent as skilled workers who are young, healthy, already integrated into communities where they worked, and already proven trustworthy through years of supervised labor. The Minister of Agriculture discusses delaying repatriation of farm workers until after the 1946 harvest. Proposals circulate to retain prisoners on temporary work permits before eventual return to Germany. But international pressure mounts quickly. The Geneva Convention requires repatriation after hostilities cease. The Soviet Union demands all German prisoners return to occupation zones for processing and potential war crimes investigation. Allied agreements at Yalta and Potsdam establish strict protocols for handling German prisoners. Britain cannot make exceptions without violating international agreements and creating precedents that might endanger British prisoners held by other nations in future conflicts. The official position holds absolutely firm. All prisoners must return to Germany for proper demobilization, and then they can apply through normal immigration channels if they wish to return to Britain. No exceptions whatsoever. International law must be respected. The precedent of allowing prisoners to remain in their captor nations could create serious complications in managing post-war Europe. December 1947, and the last German prisoners finally leave Britain. 2.5 years after the war ended, every single one of those 12,000 men who requested to stay is forced to return home. They board ships bound for Germany, process through demobilization centers and occupation zones, receive discharge papers, and confront the reality they desperately tried to avoid. Cities in ruins, an economy completely collapsed, families scattered or dead, occupation authorities controlling every single aspect of daily life, and a nation divided into zones that will soon become separate countries as East and West Germany split along ideological lines with barbed wire between them. But the story doesn't end with repatriation, not even close. Many prisoners who worked British farms maintained relationships with the families who employed them. Letters crossed the North Sea and the English Channel regularly. Requests for sponsorship arrive. Applications for immigration through legal channels are submitted. The British government establishes the European Voluntary Workers Program in 1947, actively recruiting foreign workers for industries facing severe labor shortages. Former prisoners apply through this program, receive approval, and return to Britain, not as prisoners this time, but as legal immigrants. Slowly but steadily, former prisoners find ways back to Britain. They return as landed citizens, building new lives in the country that treated them better as enemies than their own homeland treated them as returning veterans. Franz Weber returns in 1949. He was only 21 years old when captured in France during the 1940 campaign. He worked on a farm near Cirencesta throughout his entire captivity. When he went home to Cologne after repatriation, he found his family's home completely destroyed and his parents living in a basement apartment among the ruins. He told them immediately that he was going back to England. They understood completely. Weber immigrated through the EVW program, returned to the exact same farm where he worked as a prisoner, and later estimated that at least 40 other former prisoners returned to the Cotswolds region alone, all building lives in communities that genuinely welcomed them despite the war. Klaus Hartmann does even better. He worked farms as a prisoner near Canterbury, returned to Germany after the war ended, then came back to Britain in 1950 and actually purchased 50 acres of land in Kent, the very same area where he once worked as a prisoner. The fields he tended while confined became his own property, his own livelihood, his own future. He expanded the farm over decades, employed British workers, and integrated completely into the local community. Werner Schmidt and Otto Fischer become business partners in a story that seems almost impossible. Schmidt served as a tank crewman captured in North Africa. Fischer was a Luftwaffe ground crew mechanic captured during the Battle of Britain. Both were imprisoned in Britain, both returned to Germany after the war ended, and both came back to Britain through the EVW program. Together, they established a successful engineering firm in Birmingham that employed 60 workers at its peak and contributed significantly to Britain's industrial reconstruction. Schmidt explained his choice simply in a 1972 interview, saying he liked the British because they made his life as tolerable as possible from the day he arrived as a prisoner. When he returned to Germany, he saw only ruins and despair. When he came back to Britain as an immigrant, he knew this was where he belonged. There was also the feeling that you could build something here, that hard work actually led to success in this country. Helmut Braun worked forestry camps in Scotland during his captivity and genuinely appreciated the landscape and enjoyed the physical labor. When he was repatriated to Germany, he described being homesick for Britain despite never having lived there as a free man. A Scottish forester from his old camp sponsored his immigration, and Braun rebuilt his entire life in the Highlands where he once worked as a prisoner. He married a Scottish woman and raised children who spoke English as their first language. Rudolph Klein worked the farm of Thomas and Margaret Henderson near York and became like family according to their daughter Elizabeth, who recalled decades later that Klein integrated completely into their household. He shared meals with them, attended local church services, and helped raise the Henderson children when their father worked long hours. When the war ended and prisoners had to leave, the Henderson family immediately began sponsoring Klein's return through official channels. Many wanted to return but faced serious bureaucratic obstacles, including immigration quotas, sponsorship requirements, and years-long waits for processing. Not every prisoner who wished to stay found a legal path back to Britain. Some married German women after returning home and started families they couldn't uproot for uncertain immigration prospects. Others found good opportunities in the new Federal Republic of Germany as Reconstruction created demand for skilled workers. The relationships between guards and prisoners proved equally lasting in unexpected ways. James Morrison's father served as a guard at a Yorkshire camp and spoke fondly throughout his entire life about the prisoners he supervised. He developed mutual respect with many of them, shared cigarettes during breaks, discussed philosophy and politics, and recognized their shared humanity despite being on opposite sides of a terrible war. Morrison Sr. maintained regular correspondence with 3 former prisoners until his death in 1968. The contrast with other theaters of war becomes absolutely stark in retrospect. Over 1 million German prisoners died in Soviet captivity due to brutal conditions, forced labor in mines and construction projects, starvation rations, exposure to the elements, disease, and execution of officers and suspected Nazis. Japanese camps killed thousands of Allied prisoners through systematic abuse and deliberate cruelty. German camps varied widely in their treatment of prisoners, but many imposed particularly harsh conditions on Soviet prisoners, resulting in millions of deaths. Britain's camps stand out dramatically for their strict adherence to Geneva Convention standards, often exceeding those minimum requirements, despite the fact that Britain itself was suffering under German bombing campaigns and U-boat blockades. The prisoners noticed this treatment, remembered it deeply, and eventually chose to return to the nation that imprisoned them humanely rather than remain in the nation that sent them to war in the first place. British public opinion remained sharply divided even years after the war ended. The British Legion passed formal resolutions opposing German prisoners remaining in Britain. Veterans who fought in North Africa, Italy, and France resented the idea of former enemies staying while they themselves struggled with unemployment and housing shortages in a Britain still recovering from 6 years of total war. But others recognized that individual men should not be judged solely by the regime they served under. Church groups advocated strongly for compassion and Christian forgiveness. Farm communities testified repeatedly to the reliability and character of prisoners they employed for years. Letters to newspapers argued that prisoners who proved themselves through years of hard work deserved serious consideration as desirable immigrants who could genuinely contribute to Britain's reconstruction. The debate reflected much deeper questions about forgiveness and reconciliation, about collective guilt, about whether soldiers bore personal responsibility for their government's crimes, about whether former enemies could truly become fellow citizens, and about whether practical economic needs should outweigh emotional resistance. By 1962, the British government transferred the remains of 171 German prisoners who died in British camps to a German war cemetery at Cannock Chase in Staffordshire. Families attended the ceremony from Germany, their mourning finally completed decades after their losses. Most prisoners had died of natural causes, disease, accidents, or pre-existing medical conditions. 2 were hanged in 1945 for the murders of fellow prisoners carried out under orders from internal Nazi leadership within the camps. Several deaths in forestry and mining operations raised questions over the years, but investigations proved inconclusive. The ceremony honored all the dead regardless of circumstance, and German families deeply appreciated Britain's respect for their fallen, even when those men died as enemies on foreign soil. The prisoners who eventually returned to Britain brought their families with them, showing wives and children the camps where they once lived, the farms where they worked for years, the countryside they came to admire, and the communities that treated them well during their captivity. Their descendants became fully British over time, integrated completely into society, contributed substantially to the economy, built successful businesses, raised families, and never forgot their fathers' and grandfathers' extraordinary experiences as prisoners who somehow preferred captivity in Britain to freedom in their own homeland. Most Britons never knew that 420,000 German prisoners lived in camps scattered across their country during World War II. They never learned about Comrie and Kempton Park and hundreds of smaller facilities holding thousands of men for years. They never heard about the orchestras and cricket matches and extensive educational programs that occupied prisoners throughout their captivity. They never understood that enemy combatants received adequate food, while British civilians endured severe rationing of basic necessities. They never discovered that 12,000 Germans formally requested to stay after the war ended. They never realized that guards who survived the hell of Dunkirk chose to treat their prisoners with a humanity shaped by their own deep understanding of war's brutality. A strange recognition gap exists today where foreign nationals remember British actions far better than Britons themselves do. German families whose fathers and grandfathers were imprisoned in Britain know this story intimately and personally. They return to visit camps that no longer exist, standing on land where barbed wire once surrounded prisoner huts, thanking Britons they meet for the treatment their relatives received 80 years ago. But most Britons walk past former campsites without any idea what once stood there, driving roads built directly over Kempton Park Camp, without realizing that thousands of tents once covered that exact ground. Living in communities where German immigrants built successful lives without knowing those immigrants first arrived as prisoners of war. Franz Weber died in Gloucestershire, surrounded by the farming community he joined as a 21-year-old prisoner so many decades earlier. Werner Schmidt and Otto Fischer built highly successful businesses and employed British workers in Birmingham for years. Helmut Braun raised an entire family in the Scottish Highlands he came to love more than his homeland. Klaus Hartmann farmed the land in Kent that he first worked behind barbed wire as a young prisoner. Hundreds of others returned quietly, integrated silently into British society, and built lives that contributed meaningfully to Britain's post-war prosperity without ever drawing attention to their unusual path to citizenship. The camps are completely gone now, their sites redeveloped for housing estates, industrial parks, or returned to agricultural use. Concrete foundations are occasionally still visible where huts once stood, but the buildings have been dismantled, guard towers removed, barbed wire torn down, and the land returned to other purposes. Museums preserve artifacts including photographs, prisoner artwork, orchestral programs, sports equipment, and handicrafts that were sold to guards and civilians decades ago. Stories have been recorded from aging prisoners who returned to visit one last time before death, along with interviews with children of guards who heard their fathers speak about the Germans they supervised for years. All of this serves as evidence of a remarkable moment when enemies chose to treat each other with unexpected humanity. The legacy lives on in immigration statistics that were never fully compiled, in families who don't advertise their origin stories, in communities where German surnames arrived through highly unusual channels, in the principle that adherence to international law even during total war serves long-term interests better than revenge or cruelty ever could, and in the recognition that individual human beings deserve dignity regardless of the uniform they wear or the flag they serve. Britain forced every single prisoner to return home between 1945 and 1947 because the Geneva Convention required it and international agreements demanded it. But international law couldn't prevent men from choosing their own futures once they were properly processed and officially released. It couldn't stop them from applying to immigrate, from finding British sponsors willing to vouch for them, from returning legally to the country that treated them better as prisoners than their homeland treated them as citizens. 12,000 men requested to stay immediately after the war ended. Thousands more found ways back across the North Sea once bureaucratic obstacles finally cleared. They voted with their feet, chose their captors over their countrymen, chose the nation that fed them adequately and housed them properly, and allowed them culture and education and recreation over the nation that sent them to fight wars of conquest that ultimately destroyed all of Europe and Germany itself. This story belongs to Britain, but Britain has largely forgotten it. It belongs to Germany, but Germans remember it quite differently. It belongs most of all to the individual men who made choices that shaped their families for generations to come. Franz Weber telling his parents in bombed-out Cologne that he was going back to England. Werner Schmidt explaining that Britain felt more like home than destroyed Germany ever could. Helmut Braun feeling homesick for Scottish forests while standing in the ruins of his actual homeland. These were men who learned through hard experience that the nation you fight for and the nation you truly belong to are not always the same thing. That sometimes your enemies treat you far better than your friends ever did, and that humanity can persist even in prisons when laws require it, and men choose to honor those laws with integrity. 12,000 German prisoners refused to leave Britain after World War II ended. Britain made them leave anyway, following international law to the letter. But thousands found their way back through legal channels, built good lives, raised families, and became genuinely British. They never forgot that confinement in Britain felt more like home than freedom in Germany ever could. They never stopped being grateful for treatment they never expected to receive as prisoners of war. They never stopped telling their children about the orchestras and cricket matches and farmers who trusted them with farm equipment that could have been weapons. They spoke about guards who survived Dunkirk and consciously refused to replicate the hatred that defined earlier conflicts. About a country that took Geneva Convention requirements seriously even while German bombs were falling on British cities every night. And about the choice they made to return to the nation that imprisoned them, because imprisonment there meant dignity that freedom elsewhere simply couldn't provide. The camps are gone now, disappeared completely from the landscape. The prisoners are all dead, the last of them passing away in recent years. But their descendants remain, living throughout Britain today. British now, Germans once, prisoners in between. They serve as living reminders that war creates strange circumstances and even stranger outcomes. That 12,000 men once genuinely preferred enemy captivity to homeland freedom. That thousands eventually got exactly what they wanted despite international law initially saying otherwise. And that the nation which chooses to treat its enemies well ultimately earns a loyalty that military victory alone can never command.